House will be in order. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on motions to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered or votes objected to under Clause 6 of Rule 20. The House will resume proceedings on postponed questions at a later time. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and agree to House Resolution 543, a resolution recognizing Hong Kong's bilateral relationship with the United States, condemning the People's Republic of China for violating their obligation to the people of Hong Kong, and supporting the people of Hong Kong's right to freedom of assembly and peacefully protest, as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 543, resolution recognizing Hong Kong's bilateral relationship with the United States, condemning the interference of the People's Republic of China in Hong Kong's affairs, and supporting the people of Hong Kong's right to protest.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, and the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on House Resolution 543.
Without objection,
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
The world is watching Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is watching the floor of the House of Representatives. People by the tens of thousands in Hong Kong have demonstrated in favor of bills we are considering here today. In doing so, they have taken great risk to themselves and showed tremendous courage. The least we could do is pass these bills. I rise today to speak in favor of these bills on Hong Kong. I'm proud to co-sponsor all of the legislation under consideration dealing with Hong Kong. I want to first focus on a bill I introduced with our colleagues, Ms. Wagner, Mr. Conley, and Mr. Yoho, the ranking member of the Asia Subcommittee, my partner on the Asia Subcommittee. This resolution demonstrates that the so-called extradition bill is an infringement on the rights of the people of Hong Kong, including their right to a high degree of autonomy that was granted to Hong Kong when that city was returned to the control of Beijing. This resolution also establishes that the House of Representatives stands with Hong Kong protesters and supports their 5 major demands. These demands are complete withdrawal of the extradition law, universal suffrage, and the election of the chief executive and all members of the Legislative Council, the establishment of an independent commission to investigate the police's excessive use of force against the protesters, the changing of the classification so these protests are not classified as riots and the participants are not classified as rioters, and finally having all charges against the people who participated in these protests dropped. Many of us in Congress and around the United States have been inspired by the people of Hong Kong standing up for their fundamental rights over the last few months. One of the protests brought nearly 25% of the entire population of Hong Kong into the streets. That is simply unprecedented. It would behoove Beijing to heed the protesters' demands. Sadly, instead of recognizing their own role in causing these protests, the Chinese Communist Party has tried to characterize the demonstrations as the handiwork of the United States. We categorically reject this assertion. These protests were motivated first and foremost in reaction to the effort by the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party for interfering in the autonomy that was promised to the people of Hong Kong. These protests were motivated by the policies of Beijing and the Hong Kong government that has increasingly reduced the city's high degree of autonomy. The state-run media has even gone so far as to accuse a particular State Department official by name of orchestrating the protests. That is an insult to the people of Hong Kong, who speak for themselves and act for themselves. Moreover, it has put that diplomat and her family in danger. This is simply unacceptable behavior, and the Stand With Hong Kong resolution criticizes this egregious action by the Chinese government. Finally, let me reiterate my support for the other complementary bills that we are considering today on Hong Kong. The first is the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2019, which was introduced by our colleague, Mr. Smith, who will be managing time on the other side. This legislation will amend the Hong Kong Policy Act of 1992 to account for the changes that have taken place over the last 25 years. The Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act also conveys to Beijing that it cannot undermine the city's freedom while expecting America to still give that city preferential trade arrangements. I am also a strong supporter of Congressman Jim McGovern's Protect Hong Kong Act, which would restrict U.S. firms' ability to sell the Hong Kong police weapons to use against protesters. I reserve the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank him for his support of democracy and democratic freedom in Hong Kong. I want to salute my colleague, Representative Smith from New Jersey, with whom I have worked for decades on this subject, whether it's religious freedom, freedom of expression, and in China. And I thank Mr. McGovern for his important leadership as chair of the China Commission and as chair of the Lantos Human Rights Commission. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Sherman, for your leadership and for yielding, in fact. So right now we're on the Protect Hong Kong Act as amended by Mr. McGovern, and I rise in support of that legislation and indeed the bills that are on the floor to support democratic freedom in Hong Kong. Mr. Speaker, for 4 months, the young people of Hong Kong have sent a stirring message to the world that the dreams of freedom, justice, and democracy can never be extinguished by injustice and intimidation. The extraordinary outpouring of courage from the people of Hong Kong stands in stark contrast to a cowardly government that refuses to respect the rule of law or live up to the one country, two systems framework, which was guaranteed more than 2 decades ago. In 1984, before the United Kingdom transferred Hong Kong to China, the Chinese government promised a high degree of autonomy for the territory in the Joint Declaration of the Question of Hong Kong, providing for an independent executive, legislature, and judiciary. Independent, ensuring the freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religion, prohibiting the central government, the Chinese government in Beijing, from interfering in the affairs that Hong Kong administers on its own according to the basic law, and pledging a path to universal suffrage. In 1997, that's when we were here doing this, when the handover occurred, America was hopeful that the people of Hong Kong would achieve this high degree of autonomy that they were promised. And this was a promise that was participated in by the UK government. Today, we must sadly conclude that China has broken that promise. For years, the people of Hong Kong have faced a barrage of unjust and harsh restrictions on their freedoms, and those who have stood up for their rights have been met with a cruel crackdown. In Congress, Democrats and Republicans in the House and in the Senate stand united with the people of Hong Kong. If America does not speak out for human rights in China because of commercial interest, then we lose all moral authority to speak out for human rights any place in the world. Since Tiananmen Square 30 years ago, many of us in a bipartisan way have been fighting this fight, and we have seen that commercial interests always win. It's always about the money. I lost my innocence on human rights in America and China all those years ago when I saw that while we talked a good talk, when it came right down to it, right, Mr. Smith, it was always about the money. Since, again, to those who want to take the repressive government's side in this discussion, I say to you, what does it profit a person if he gains the whole world and suffers the loss of his soul? And we do not want to lose the soul of our country for commercial interest, whatever those commercial interests may be. It's interesting to me, people are saying, well, you have to know both sides of the story. Okay, you want to know both sides? One side is a very repressive regime that is crushing democratic freedoms in Hong Kong at the same time that they have tried to destroy the culture, the language, the religion in Tibet at the same time as they incarcerate in education camps more than 1 million, could be 3 million Uyghur Muslims in China, while they repress religious freedom there. The list goes on and on. And the other side, young people speaking out for freedom, democratic freedoms in Hong Kong. They are so impressive. Mr. Smith and I have worked, as Mr. McGovern has, with like 3 generations, starting after Tiananmen and tanks rolling over young people who spoke out for democratic freedoms in China. The next generation, 15 years later, and now this generation of young people. So impressive are they that even the more senior freedom fighters in Hong Kong are impressed by their courage and their stick-to-itiveness to it. Today, the House is proud to pass the bicameral, bipartisan Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act to reaffirm America's commitment to democracy. And that doesn't mean a democracy like it means democratic freedoms, human rights, and the rule of law in the face of Beijing's crackdown. And Beijing thinks that they can rule because of money. It always comes down to that. Thank you, Chairman McGovern. Thank you, Congressman Smith, for your work to ensure an honest accounting of the situation in Hong Kong and to ensure accountability for those responsible for the crackdown. We are grateful to Chairman McGovern for his leadership on the Protect Hong Kong Act, which suspends sales of crowd control and other equipment to the Hong Kong police force, as Mr. Sherman pointed out earlier. Thank you, Mr. Sherman, for your role in all of this. And thank you for your resolution calling for the Hong Kong government to address protesters' demands and condemning police brutality, in addition to China's efforts to falsely accuse U.S. diplomats of fueling unrest. Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Last week, Martin Lee, the grandfather of Hong Kong democracy, we started working with him decades ago. He said, "We fear Hong Kong will become just another Chinese city." That means one without any of the freedoms that they were guaranteed. The future of Hong Kong, the future of autonomy, freedom, and justice for millions is at stake. America must stand with Hong Kong. It's very interesting that when they were having, in the first weeks of the demonstration, or the first months of the demonstration, 2 million people, mostly young people, were in the streets. And people were saying, oh my heavens, 2 million people turning out. And you remember that 2 million is 25% of the population of Hong Kong. There's 8 million people, 25% of the population in the streets. And the beat goes on. And hopefully they will hear from this Congress our support for their human rights, and that we will not sell our souls for money at the expense of our values. I also want to thank a distinguished chairman of the committee, Mr. Elliot Engel, for his leadership on all this over time. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time. I urge and I vote on all of the above to join in bipartisan, bicameral support for the people of Hong Kong. Thank you.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I want to thank so many people for working so hard on this piece of legislation. My good friend, Jim McGovern, the principal co-sponsor and just a great friend on fighting tyranny in China. He chairs the China Commission. I'm the ranking member. Previously, I've chaired it, and so we've gone back and forth in working at leadership. So I want to thank him especially for that. Also, of course, Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall, Chairman Sherman and Yoho for their strong support for this bipartisan legislation, and a number of staffers who I will speak to in a moment. Matter of fact, do it now. Scott Flipsy for his great work on this bill, landmark work going back to 5 years ago. John Stivers, Reva Price from the Speaker's office, who has been tenacious on this legislation. Jennifer Hendrickson White, Brian Burak, Janice Koguyatan, Teresa Liu, Darrow Merton, Doug Anderson, Piero Tozzi, Sabrina Tsai, just so many very good people who have all pulled together in a bipartisan way to make sure that this legislation comes to the floor and becomes law. Mr. Speaker, Since the 1989 Tiananmen Square massacre 30 years ago, I've had the privilege of working with colleagues on both sides of the aisle, including Speaker Pelosi, on human rights, the rule of law, and democracy for the People's Republic of China. I also want to thank Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader here in the House, the Republican leader, who has put me on it's his selection on the China Commission, and for his strong support for this legislation as well. We have always believed, Mr. Speaker, that every person in China deserves better than the brutality so many endured every single day and the systematic violations of their universally recognized human rights. Tragically, under President Xi Jinping, human rights abuse throughout China has significantly worsened, including the pervasive use of torture, religious persecution, and human trafficking. Solemn promises made by Beijing are rarely kept, and far too many leaders of the free world are far too eager to blindly accept fiction over fact. Broken promises are the rule, not the exception, under Xi Jinping, and the people of Hong Kong are suffering because of it. During the 2014 umbrella movement, the world saw the courageous people of Hong Kong demanding that Beijing not renege on promises made to ensure universal suffrage, basic rights, and authentic elections in 2017. Despite President Xi Jinping's brutal crackdown on protesters then and now, triggered this time by an outrageous proposed policy to facilitate extradition, the resolve, the courage, the tenacity and clarity of purpose of the people of Hong Kong shines through the darkness like the sun. 2 days ago, Reuters reported that President Xi Jinping told leaders in Nepal, quote, "Anyone attempting to split China in any part of the country will end in crushed bodies and shattered bones." President Xi's government excels in crushing bodies, shattering bones, torturing dissidents, and filling concentration camps, massive crimes against humanity for which there has been little or no accountability or sanction. But today, Mr. Speaker, we're simply urging the Chinese president and the Hong Kong chief executive, and we have that obligation under our own laws, but to faithfully honor the government's promises. Honor the promises made in the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration that facilitated the conveyance of Hong Kong from the United Kingdom to China, beginning on July 1st, 1997, that autonomy, human rights, including press, assembly, association, and religion, would be exactly the same as before the handover for at least 50 years. Honor the promises made in the Basic Law of Hong Kong, adopted by China's National People's Congress in 1990, before the give back of Hong Kong, that autonomy and rights would be protected. Even before the latest round of protests, Mr. Speaker, the U.S. State Department has noted that rights and liberties in Hong Kong have diminished. They're not living up to their solemn promises made in order for the Hong Kong conveyance to occur. You know, the great young leader Joshua Wong reminded us that a fourth of the population of Hong Kong, about 2 million people, turned out for one of the peaceful protests. Mr. Speaker, where has ever that happened? 5 years ago, Mr. Speaker, in 2014, joined by Mrs. Pelosi, I introduced the bipartisan Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act. We did it again in 2015, in 2017, and again this year, again with my good friend from Massachusetts. Our new bill, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, is a blueprint for meaningful action. Specifically, the Act directs the Secretary of State to certify to Congress annually whether Hong Kong continues to deserve special treatment under U.S. law different from mainland China in such matters as trade, customs, sanctions enforcement, law enforcement cooperation, and protection of human rights and the rule of law. It encourages the State Department not to deny visas based on an applicant's arrest or detention for participating in nonviolent activities in Hong Kong. It requires an annual report from the Commerce Department on whether the Hong Kong government adequately enforces U.S. export controls and sanctions laws, including on those goods and services transshipped to North Korea, Iran, or other countries relating to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, violations of human rights, and narcotics trafficking, and more. Requires an assessment of whether U.S. origin items, including software, technology, and services, have been transferred from Hong Kong to China in violation of U.S. law and have been used by China for mass surveillance, predictive policing, or for social credit system. Now, some of you might ask, what's this social credit system? Mr. Speaker, it's a ubiquitous, totalitarian, brave new world system scheduled for implementation by 2020 that will use public records, online activity, and other tools of surveillance to aggregate data on every single solitary Chinese citizen and business, and use that data to monitor, shape, and rate financial, social, religious, or political behaviors. It requires the Secretary of State to submit a strategy to Congress to protect U.S. citizens and businesses in Hong Kong from the erosion of autonomy and the rule of law because of actions taken by the Chinese Communist governments. It requires the President to identify and sanction persons in Hong Kong or in mainland China responsible for the erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy and serious abuses of human rights. It tracks the Magnitsky Act, which Mr. McGovern and I worked so hard to enact into law, so that we deny visas and also deny the ability to do business here for those people who are responsible for these egregious abuses. And it contains a waiver provision that helps ensure that our actions protect the great people of Hong Kong and enhance the autonomy rather than inadvertently harming it. So it gives real flexibility to the President and to the State Department to make the right call. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I've heard it said that the business of Hong Kong is business. It is that. But it's also clear to me now that the business of Hong Kong is freedom and democracy. I reserve the balance of our time.
He reserves the